Yeah.
Hello, everyone. I don't have a mic, so I'm going to try to speak as loud as I can. Um, Today, we're doing a detection engineering panel with my wonderful panelists. First, we have Tammy Trong. She's a threat detection engineer at Snowflake. Then we have Christina Devlin. She does senior security engineering managing, and has previously been at Twitch, NASA, and Stripe. And then we have Shannon McCormick, who does detection and response engineering at Salesforce. And then I'm your moderator. My name is Julie Agnes Sparks. I'm a security researcher at Datadog. So I want to get us started with just like a nice icebreaker question. So can you talk about your favorite threat detection story and kind of dive into either one you've done personally or one that you've been a part of or one that you read about if you're not comfortable talking about one you've done personally?
I can start. So I feel like everyone remembers like their first true positive alert. I feel like there's like those little proud moments, those little wins. And I was just starting in security and threat detection, and I had done an Okta hunt and built out a detection for same factor across multiple accounts. And seeing that alert come in, and it was actually our red team who was performing one of the red team exercises, and they had gained access to another employee's account and added their own authentication factor. And so just being able to Slack them and just kind of be like, to assist, like, what are you doing over there? So it's really cool to see, although not like a real malicious threat actor, it was, internal and I guess an exercise and being able to actually catch something. And it gives you, I guess, a little bit of validation. It's like, hey, we're doing something that people, that the actors can come over and get access to our environment, and it's something that's provides value.
That's awesome. Catching a red team doing red team things is true. I believe that's classic. I think my favorite is one time we were looking at writing a detection for like a regex of someone. We were looking at like our contractor G Suite. We were doing like a threat hunt, and we were looking at people potentially messaging like, their first name plus their last name at like gmail.com or something, like sending their personal accounts things from their work accounts, which there's not exactly like a clear business case for, but we were just like digging and we found contractors sending themselves links to like tickets in our ticketing system. And so we were like, well, how would that be useful though? Because to access the ticketing system, you would need like all of this authentication. It definitely works. And we figured out that there were like some gaps that had emerged just in the configuration of that ticketing system. And so that was really fun because it was just like a fun tangent to go down.
Yeah. Yeah, I have to say, like, the most fulfilling experience I've had so far is once, like, a C-suite, like, a leadership came to the detection and response team and said, like, there's an anonymous Twitter account that's, like, threatening to leak insider information. Like, can you validate this? And it's an incredibly vague ask. So you're like, I have no idea where to begin. But after, like, digging into the data and, like, kind of thinking through it, we were able to piece together, like, evidence and, like, point towards an individual of interest. So it was really satisfying to take like a super vague ask and find meaning from it and like the security telemetry and actually like find something bad going on and then like use that to push further controls and further like use cases for like the value add of detection and response. So that was super satisfying.
That's awesome. I'm going to go a little bit deeper into detection writing, but how do you think about the labor costs of high precision versus low precision detections? As someone who's been at the end of like some detections that we can't control, like due to being a subsidiary where the parent company was blasting us with like low confidence detections and paging us about that. But like meanwhile, we were like spending so much effort on our own detections. I feel like it seems like it's really easy to try to write like a lot of detections and try to say like, well, we have coverage because we have this many firing all the time and they're responded, to within like this amount of time. And I don't know, I feel like there are a lot of metrics you can kind of create for yourself by creating like low confidence detections. I feel like it's so much more valuable if you get like a tight loop as well between the responder and like tuning the detection so that you can kind of loop it really quickly, which is something you can't always do with like parent company situations. But I think like if the person who's responding to it, if you get paged, like the most frustrating thing is to know that there's nothing you can do to prevent it if it's like a low fidelity alert or detection, and it's just going to keep triggering. Like that's so frustrating. But if you, as someone who's like got like boots on the ground type of thing, like you're in a really good position to tune it and make it a lot better. So I feel like it feels way more satisfying to invest like your own emotional labor, your own like time, intellectual labor into like alerts that you or detections that you're responding to and you can also fix.
And like make them higher accuracy.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And also like shut them down or pause them if they're not helpful. But yeah, I think if you like know the intention behind it and you have the ability to like get in there and like mess with it a little bit and make it, increase the fidelity and kind of like document why. I think change control can be really nice there. I think that's really satisfying and the fun part of detection engineering.
Yeah.
I feel like going off of what you were saying in terms of like wanting to focus on those high fidelity detections, sometimes those like low precision, low hanging fruit detections though are worthwhile because if you, I guess it's like initial access is like typically like first way to get in, right? And so those are typically going to be really noisy and sometimes just benign. But sometimes benign behavior can lead to malicious behavior. And so investing almost a fine balance into both like the, I guess like low precision and high precision, having a balance between the two and working your way up from there. I feel like we've implemented risk-based alerting. And so those lower fidelity detections can be labeled as like a lower severity alert, and they might not fire atomically, but with another activity that is observed in your environment can fire together and tell that story about like the attack story.
Yeah, I feel like some low precision
Louder.
I feel like some low precision detections are like inevitable just working for an enterprise because like pretty much everyone is under some sort of regulation, some sort of compliance coverage. So like it's inevitable that like security and specifically detection who have log coverage and just the tooling in place to do that is going to get pulled into like compliant asks and like regulatory concerns. But I think like you also need to be mindful of like the output of your team. Like if you're just producing like low precision, like noisy alerts, that's going to impact your relationship with like partner teams that either are triaging that detection for you or just kind of like, like using it as a gauge of like what's going on, like what is the output of the security team and like, oh, the detection team is just creating noise and toil and more work for us. Like that creates a lot of friction with partner teams. So like there's always like the inevitability that like it's hard to be high fidelity like from the beginning and, it takes time, but you want to demonstrate with your partner teams that you're working on that and you're developing that relationship and you're like aware of it and mindful of it and you're not just like trying to create more work for someone else. So like I think just like being able to like talk about it and like being direct and also being like what Christina was saying about like we want to get better, like we want your feedback to make it better, like helps create like positive relationships instead of like more work for other teams.
Yeah, I think about those like noisier, like lower value alerts in like a way that they can be chained together to then signify a larger, like more malicious behavior. Because like sometimes there's like one detection that fires for something that's malicious. And like that might be a lower value alert that maybe is like a misconfiguration that happened or like something small. But then if those are low or medium, you might not ever see them. But if you can bring those detections together and then populate them up to like a critical when multiple of those behaviors happen for an entity, then I think that brings a lot of value as well.
Shannon, actually, you brought up a good point about like collaborating with also like your incident response team. Like they are like our stakeholders, the receivers of our alerts, and building that relationship with them. For us, we've implemented like a threat detection lifecycle where they are included as part of that. And so they also review what we like have as like an alerting and detection strategy. So they understand why we felt the alert as well. And so they're not just receiving it and not really having context of like why we built it.
Toss, yeah. Cool. A little louder. So how do you think about data quality and logging visibility when you're writing detections?
I'll go. Yeah, I think when thinking about like data quality and logging, it's also important, like it's super helpful too to know that like the tooling you have in place, whether it's a SIM or something, like you've built custom, like there's always a limit to how much data you can collect unless you're like at Google where like the storage fees are actually like, absorbed, you're at the storage company itself, like Google or Amazon might be the exception to this rule, but like largely everywhere else, like you have to pay to store that data and you're limited in both like the volume and the time period. So most places have a limit of like, oh, like my Splunk only goes 30 days back, or like, oh, I have like X terabytes of data I can store in here. So you have to be super mindful when like, you're setting that up, and you're hopefully, it's a collaborative process of like, what data do I need? Like what data has the highest value in terms of detection and response, and kind of like, what are areas of noise? Like, let's say like everyone uses Zoom in your company. Maybe you don't need like all these process event logs related to Zoom. Like that's an easy one to tune out noise to get like decrease the volume of logs, to like stay within like cost needs for the team. So I think, again, like this partnership of understanding like the limitations of like what you can store, and like also the balance of like what visibility do I need, where like if an incident occurs, like I know I need these data sources and I'm going to jump to them right away. And then, just sharing that knowledge and making it very clear when you build things out, like what's available and why. And like if something can't be stored or you have to filter something out, like having it documented. So like, let's say an incident happens and you're like, the reason we don't have these logs is because of blah. Like, let's revisit it and like now get the funding to do it. So I think it's really important to like think through it, track it, and understand the why, just to have like end-to-end an understanding of like the data you have, what you're not able to store and why, and what you need, and like the value it adds to like the security team at large.
I feel like one exercise you can do is kind of like walk through that and like map out everything you have and things that you don't. Well, not everything, but like map out a lot of what you have, what you don't have. Like other than in the actually like picking a thing to write a detection on and then doing that is like threat hunting. I feel like also like in terms of having like powerful logs, you really need to be able to like be flexible about using them, whether you're using like Jupyter notebooks or whatever queries you're running. I think you really want your team to be like sharp and able to like maneuver through the logs well, but you also want to be like, reaching the limit and figuring out like what you don't have, what's really slow. Maybe you have like load bearing queries, or you just have like a query that you're running and relying on as an alert, but something changed on the back end and it's like super slow. And if you were to respond to that detection firing, it would take way too long, or it would time out and you wouldn't have all the data, something like that. So I think running through it as a threat hunt, like as an exercise, like, hey, let's run down this class of potential attacks, something like that. I think it can be really fun. I think also if you include someone like from maybe your team isn't the one that builds and maintains like the logging pipeline, or like query platform, but also if you can invite someone, like one or two people, because it's really fun. I think a lot of people from other teams will want to join you, but I think like if you get like one or two people from a team like that, or a team like the authentication management team, something like that, to join you, I think it can be like really, really worthwhile and kind of help improve the fidelity of the logging platform and your data that you're getting, and kind of like show them as well, like, what is it like to actually use it? Because I feel like we would get that question a lot. And it's hard to explain. And if you're like running an incident, something like that, you can't really break down like, I'm looking for this, but when I try like these fields, I have to join across these tables and it's like, they don't match at all, something like that. Like if you can figure that out, like not in a critical moment, it's like really helpful, I think.
That's true. To be honest, I am really guilty of like just asking for a lot of telemetry, expensive queries. I got an email the other day saying like around like a $10 or $30 query. It's like we also need to do our jobs. I want to look at historical data, and I have to do a large look back sometimes to get enough data, the data that I want, and justifying that. And I think in detection engineering, you're a little like telemetry greedy, right? Like you want more data, you want more context. And so like really being thoughtful about what you need exactly. I think we have like an initiative now where we have to address what overlogging looks like and how can we pare that down so it's the most cost efficient. But in terms of like detection, I think that like having the data quality, the pipeline, making sure that the processes are in place, and if you're working with external teams, what that agreement looks like, whose like roles and responsibility is it to maintain that? Because if the pipeline breaks, so do your detections, and then you're just not really building detections on anything. So,
Yeah, I think like detection and response ends up becoming almost a data engineering problem, because like in order to do our jobs, we rely really heavily on the data that's available. And so the teams that support us or the internal work that we do for doing our own logging pipelines is just really important. And then also storage, right? So like a lot of stuff gets moved to cold storage. then it's like really terrible to like pull back out, and usually only for an IR reason. So how much data can we have? What does it normalize like? What's the quality of it from even the source is really important. Okay, next question. How do you approach threat modeling systems and infrastructure in your cloud environments, and how do you prioritize?
I'd say for us, I feel like you kind of go back to like the foundations of threat modeling, right? Like whether it be a cloud environment or not, you look to the basics of like, okay, like what's the scope of what you want to threat model? You don't want to. I think it's easy to get overwhelmed by what you're threat modeling, and you kind of want to scope down to like the system or the feature that you are threat modeling. And so looking at the scope first, then looking at your entities, what like people, what users are involved, what services, what processes and data stores are there, and where does the data flow? And we look at it as like, is the data flowing from a higher trust zone to a lower trust zone? And those are the areas that we want to focus on. And we follow Stride to look at the threats. And from there, you can identify what mitigations do you want to put in place to address those threats that you're concerned about. And in terms of mitigations, then you have those discussions of, well, are we putting in detective controls? Are we going to put in preventative controls? And what's achievable? And working with like other software engineers to build in those preventative controls that you want to put in place. I feel like there's a huge negotiation aspect there because I think, at least for us, I feel like the default has been like, okay, they could just build the detection for it. It's quick and easy, rather than putting in the little extra work to put in those preventative controls that I think would be a little bit better for our security posture-wise.
Yeah, I think another way to kind of threat model, building on top of what you said, is also like you can leverage like prior incidents, and as well as like maybe a lightweight bug bounty program, maybe not something where if you have a bug bounty program going, it can be a way to kind of figure out like what is publicly facing, things like that. So just in case you're like, you don't want something to get past you because it'll get to like the attackers are using similar techniques. So if they're also kind of threat modeling just from the outside. So I think bug bounty is valuable there. And prior incidents as well, because you can see like if it was like a valid attacker, were they able to pivot from, their initial access, or if it was something that went wrong and kind of cascaded, you can track that as well. I think, also relying on like red team, or if you do any adversary simulation exercises, those can also be really valuable depending on like the service it is. There might be some detections you can run there, or detections you can write.
Yeah, we don't really threat model, which is maybe like not great. We should do exactly what Tammy explained. That was a great like end-to-end description. But I think like what's been really helpful in terms of like understanding your environment and like gaps and value adds for detection and response is what Tammy said of like identifying preventative controls that are already in place. And like, so like if you could always create a detection that like is already covered by a preventative control, but like ultimately the end goal is different. Like if that detection fires, it's like a control breaking, like it's like a defense in depth, and not necessarily like, ideally like that shouldn't happen, and then like kind of how you triage it is a little bit different. But I think looking at the preventative controls is a really good place to start, because you can see like where you can value add of either, there's a gap here because the team doesn't have time to put a control in place, or like, like there is these public facing resources that we haven't had time to remediate. And then, like as a detection team, you can add value there like pretty quickly as they like find the timing and the resources to like ultimately put something preventative and longer term in place. So I think it's a good place to start in terms of like having impact and value for your team. And it helps kind of guide like where you should begin, because ultimately like it feels like you should do everything. Like, and you could do everything. And it's like the most value add you have in detection is like finding the areas of impact and explaining that up. And then like, also like preventing burnout for your team. Like you shouldn't just be churning detections. Like you want to have like high fidelity, impactful work, and like identifying that clearly is super helpful for both like leadership, business goals, but also like morale. Like, oh, what I'm doing matters.
Yeah. Kind of like to bounce off of that, like how do you approach determining your crown jewels that you then write detections on? So like knowing you have these like huge environment scopes, like how do you figure out what's important to the business and where the most critical detections can be put in place?
I think having a security data lake where you have all your logs ingested is really important. And working with the business to understand what is important to them, right? So everyone from like the CEO down to management to IC level, where your source code lives, what's important to them. And then from there, you can identify that in your security data lake. And ideally, everything is in one place. And it's in a sense like an asset management, right? I struggle with this internally because I want to use it for security, but I don't want to be the asset manager, right? It's a different, I'd say, different responsibility. But you also want to know where everything lives, and you want to work with like your IT partners on further like administrative endpoints and servers what they care about.
I feel like asset management is super important, and synthesizing that info, like configuration data, like what's actually running, to security data lakes is like so important. So such a huge value add. It's also so hard. I think a lot of times, figuring out what's running on a host, not just like how is it configured, but also like maybe someone's running a custom script on it. Maybe they're doing it every time. Maybe we don't have that config file. It's not like in source code the way it usually is, or maybe there's some manual steps being taken that we can't track, or there's just drift from what is set up to what is actually running, like containers, things like that. It can be like super tricky. But it's such a huge value add. And I totally feel you when you say like, it's like, I don't want to do it, but I really need it. And a lot of times that can kind of fall to the detection and response team or the incident response team, whatever team is like, we desperately need this. Then other teams might say, well, we can't get it to you. So then you can just start like getting nerd psyched and thinking like, well, I could do it like in this amount of time. And then you're like, oh, why did I start doing this? But yeah, I think some like security infrastructure teams, something like that, you can kind of lean on. In the same way you might like wind up leaning on like the output of like AppSec teams, things like that for like the threat modeling, things like that to help you figure out crown jewels. I think also like past incidents are obviously key because you don't want the same thing to happen again because it's like embarrassing and feels bad. And yeah, I think threat modeling and so yeah, similar.
Yeah. I think having like asset management is definitely like super important, and it's hard to do. But I mean, like I've worked at big companies where like you get an alert and you're like, all right, I see this host name. You try to figure out like, is this a workstation? Is this a server? What's running on it? And you're like, there's no logging of what this is. And then you run it down and then you're like, someone in a building plugged something in. Like you're just kind of like, it took me a day to figure out what this is. Like, so there's a lot of value add just in terms of like speed and like understanding and context of like what's running in our environment and why. And like, maybe a software engineer has like certain patterns on their host, which someone in HR wouldn't. Like having that context really quickly of like, who owns this host? What is this host used for is like super helpful and valuable in terms of like, understanding like the why. But I think also like in terms of like crown jewels and like identifying areas with like impact, like one, like knowing what's in your environment is huge, but also like talking with partner teams that like, the infrastructure team, the like compute team, like people that help build the environment that you're protecting know a lot more. Like you'll probably have like some things in mind of like, all right, we run AWS. Like I care if someone like uses the root account, which no one should use. Like there's some low hanging fruit in terms of like crown jewels in areas with like really big impact if actually successfully abused. But like leaning on partner teams that actually set up the infrastructure and they're like, well, there is a break glass account and like that should never be used. Like it's helpful to know kind of all the edge cases of like, how to kind of like the specific nuance of how your environment is set up, and then like leveraging kind of like how detection and response, like how you handle that to, again, add value to your specific enterprise. Because I think especially when you're internal, like it's really helpful to understand like the unique specifics of your environment versus like if your detection and response for like customers, like it's more general, like your skill set. Like specifics are super valuable when you're inside a corporation.
One other thing I think is that if you know your attackers, this is like an area that can really help you. If you know, like, say you work in the games industry and you know that some of your peer companies have been, you know, breached by certain attackers, and you know certain things based on what they've posted publicly, what they've shared with you privately, like if they're, you know, sharing information about like, you know, IOCs, things like that, that can be really helpful. But you can also just figure out, even if from Target or from other companies in any industry, you can figure out like what are attackers targeting. And I think that's something like you want to obviously stay on top of the news and just read when they're like, there have been really, really, really good write-ups recently about like attacker like TTPs or attacker like attack paths, vectors, things like that. Which just like talk me through like, were they just casting a wide net and they happen to find us? Were they targeting us specifically? What did they want once they got access to us? I think that could be really helpful for figuring out, okay, well, what do we definitely want to protect? Because it seems like they specifically want that, something like that.
Yeah.
I think could be really helpful. And also it's kind of fun. Just trying to do like, you can figure out like, if you have like a threat intel team, if your company is big enough, if your org is big enough, or if you have a threat intel like service that you integrate with, that you consume data from, or there's just a ton of open source threat intel information. It's just fun.
Yeah, I feel like threat intelligence is really a helpful feeder into like detection and response in terms of finding value. But sometimes, at least what I've experienced, is threat intelligence tries to like boil the ocean. Like there's so much to like monitor and care about. And really like, I think the most valuable or like the best value add of threat detection feeding into detection and response, or threat intelligence feeding into detection and response, is like focusing on like your specific industry that you're in, whether it's like a fintech or like certain known threat actors that have targeted peer companies, and like catering your detections towards those indicators, because you feel like there's a high confidence that like if this is like actually a true positive, like this could have like immense impact on our enterprise. So I definitely think, yeah, TI can like have a huge impact if done well.
Yeah. Sometimes it's a lot to wade through, as you said, like boiling the ocean. But
I think that's where I think back to like as like your original question of like identifying your crown jewels, where that's important, because if TI is able to like identify an IOC, you can easily parse everything if all of your data sources are also consolidated. And one of the things I forgot to mention is like not only having that consolidation of data, but also like the asset tagging, right? Like I think working with the, you know, your respective like software engineering teams to tag, like, is this a production resource? Is this dev? Because you don't want to also waste your time if it's a dev environment and there really aren't any controls in place. Config is just Wild West because they can't, right? They're just a dev environment. And so being able to appropriately tag those in an automated fashion so that you have the data and they can do their jobs as well.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of what you guys are mentioning is like context. So like how do we provide context via threat intelligence or via tagging? In the ideal world, how would you like to see context for detection engineering? So like, would you like to see it like inline in the log? Is it like a lookup table you reference? Like what context is important and how do you get it?
I feel like it would be really sick. Ideal situation is like each detection comes with a Jupyter notebook that is completely populated with like, here's a link to like prior incidents that are related to this, or here's like where our inspiration came from. Here are past, you know, times that we've handled this. Like, do we know, is it like high fidelity? Like, does this just fire all the time and we don't know what to do with it? Something like that would be not ideal, but something where it's also giving you the tools that you need to pivot on the data to say like, has this happened in the past year? Like, did we see anything else weird from this post, like in the past, like, you know, a few minutes before and after, things like that. I feel like that can be super helpful and kind of give people the creativity to feel like, oh, well, now that I'm looking, like I could look at anything. I don't have to be like, oh, how do I log into that? So, you know, like if it's just kind of seamless, I feel
Yeah, like the context is like available right in that Jupyter notebook.
Yeah, and even if it's not already written context, it's like you can grab it yourself and you could add it for the next time it fires. You can like modify the Jupyter notebook, something like that is like ideal.
I would want it in line with the logs. Like I should be able to identify it in that AWS config table, and I could like join it with the CloudTrail event log, and it's presented for our incident response team in the alert itself. No extra lookups.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of like inline in the log. Like if we ingest it, like let's just like print it in the log. It's all there. You can write detections on it. You can do IR on it. You can store it in a table, but it's available.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think like from a dev perspective, like inline is definitely the way to do it. I think from like a security perspective, I really like the like when I think of context, I think of the word like an enrichment. Like when I see like an incident or an alert, like I want all of that information like in one pane of glass. Like I don't want to jump to like 5 different tools to be like, what's their job title? Like what team are they in? You know, like what have they like, is this normal for them in the last 30 days? Like all of that additional context like in line, which like it is like that's the goal. Like I haven't been somewhere where we've built that successfully, and I haven't seen like products in the space that have done that successfully either. So I think that's like it's a long-term vision of like the industry that like hopefully we're pushing towards.
Yeah, I would really like the fact that we would have enrichments like from like IDPs and like our EDRs, and like all of that data would be like available in a log with that related entity or IP address. So like you can just quickly go through, you can understand like what the scope of, for example, with like a detection, like if someone's taking a change, like making a change and they're in IT, right? Like don't care about it. But like if for some reason an executive is doing something suspicious, then I want to know. And like you need that IDP data. You need like to know if it's like a device that's registered, if it's managed with the company. And so just like getting all that information is just so powerful.
I feel like that's one area where having like really powerful data science, like whether it's your data platform team or it's your team, whoever is doing it, like because some of that can get really slow. If you're joining across multiple tables, like, hey, I saw something sketchy from like this IP address, and I wanted to see like what AWS account is it in, like what service runs in that AWS account, like who owns it, like who last logged it. Like I feel like all of that, what team is the person on, like what is the org structure. I feel like a lot of that can get super expensive quickly, especially like if you're running it frequently as like an alert. So you really want to have a good handle of like SQL or whatever it is you're using, or like really good ways that you're like storing things as tables and kind of caching the data so that you can pull from it quickly going forward. I think I've had some like really good data platform folks that I've worked with who have been like so clutch there. Shout out to that.
Nice. When you're approaching detection engineering, we talk a lot about like suspicious and malicious behaviors because you're thinking about an external attacker. Like, how does your stakeholders and your detection approach change when it's like an insider?
I think it can be really okay. So I think for the most part, you can consider an insider threat is going to look really similar from the logs to like a compromised user, like compromised credentials, or like I forget what it's called, like evil UEBA or something. CEBA.
Oh, never mind.
I think a lot of times though, you don't need to think about like whether they've turned against the company or something like that. I think sometimes it can just be simpler to think like this user account is compromised and it's doing things that might be within the scope of what this user does, but it's like sketchy and they shouldn't be doing it this way, or they're doing something that is, you know, they're downloading a ton of things and they're allowed to download, but they're not supposed to do it this way or not those specific files, things like that. But one thing I do think is nice about insider threat, and one reason that like it can be really like satisfying to look into, is you have like all the clues, kind of like you have endpoint logs in most cases. Like you have a lot of what you would need to piece together a story while you're kind of like building out like what happened, like did anything happen. You're looking into different. I feel like that can be like really satisfying, even if it like maybe feels bad, but maybe you can, because I don't know, maybe they were compromised or something, and so it's not, you don't have to feel like you're betraying them. I don't know.
Yeah, you can kind of use like the same detections you write for external attackers.
Yeah, for
insider, and then kind of like overlap with maybe some unique ones.
Yeah. The only exception I feel like is a lot of times if it's like there are specifically known disgruntled employees or something like that, where like there are layoffs and there's a case where there might be just, you know, like I think there's some cases where you actually do have to say, okay, well, they might be more strategic. I don't know, but those are sad, obviously.
Yeah. I think what you were saying before, the detections can be the same, but obviously the threat actor is a little different if it's external versus insider. I feel like for the external one, right, like they don't have access and they shouldn't have access to your environment, but for an insider, they already in your environment. They have the access they need. And if they don't, they can ask IT for access, and depending on how sensible your IT is, like they can give it to them or not. And so looking, like I feel like one of the things to skip over would be like that initial access, like those types of detections. And then from there, like is their behavior the same? Are they working from like the same location that they typically have been? And so that historical data helps with that. With insider threat, I think that like, yeah, depending on, I guess, what are the motives? You like I'm all saying, like, what are the motives of that insider threat versus like an external threat actor? And it could be this disgruntled employee who just wants to either install that door, maintain access, or just external data. There's IP data. One of the interesting ones more recently has been like the North Korean DPRK IT worker story right now, where you have North Korean workers who are impersonating essentially U.S. workers and trying to just have just gain employment is way of passive revenue to help their initiatives. And so they are either have someone that works for them here in the U.S. and they have a laptop farm where you send the laptop to, and they are working out of maybe a state that they're not there. I guess like when you first get hired, what you say, like where you say you work. And so looking for those types of indicators, which can be challenging if, right, like we also went through like the pandemic where a lot of people did work remote. People travel, people on vacation and bring their laptops. So the environment looks different. And there are all these other noise that could potentially just deny someone working on vacation or visiting family. And so how do you identify whether it's a Korean worker or someone who's just on vacation?
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like there's like a lot of nuance, like what you're saying, to like the insider threat space and like finding value. Because a lot of times, like, because largely you want to answer like, is this normal for this person? And that can have a lot of variety, not only by like their job title, like just like an engineer versus like a business analyst, but also like specific teams within engineering have different like, you know, behaviors and access and understanding, you know, like getting that nuance of state of like, is this normal for someone in this team? And like being able to like, one, baseline it, and two, compare it to like others to get that context of like, what is normal? And is this really a deviation from normal versus like, oh, maybe it's a specific project, or you're like on loaner with a partner team, or you're traveling, like maybe it's a deviation that can be explained. Like, I think there's a lot of nuance to insider threat that's like hard to scale. So I definitely think like in terms of like career advice, it's a good skill set to know in terms of like thinking through these problems and finding meaning in data and being able to explain why and then convey that to a partner team, whether it's legal or HR or leadership. Because I think, yeah, it's just like a very hard thing to automate and to scale, especially as like companies get bigger and bigger and there's so much kind of like, you know, maybe you're in a global company and people can work everywhere. And like maybe there's like no travel restrictions, or understanding kind of like, you know, like the specifics of like maybe someone requests a lot of access and that's normal. And like some of these low hanging opportunities of like someone's requesting a lot of access or someone's sending a lot of external emails, like kind of becomes noisy if you generalize it like that. Cause you know, maybe the salespeople send a ton of external emails. And like, you don't want to whitelist all of the salespeople, but how do you like find that balance of like noisy versus like high fidelity and like scale that with like the variety of like teams and like the number of people you have? So it's a hard problem to solve. It's definitely really interesting from a data perspective though.
Yeah, I think about like focusing on like data exfiltration techniques. I feel like that's almost like the best approach with insider threat, because like you want to like see when the data is leaving the organization, and like otherwise, a lot of the actions they could take could be actually pretty normal. And what I've seen before is like an interest in like sales data and like intellectual property. So like, you know, like focusing on like your Google Drive logs, focusing on like your Salesforce logs, email logs, like all those things can be like really vital, but there is a lot of noise with it because it could just be regular activity. So that part is really hard. I want to jump back to false positives and kind of like how you guys are thinking about the process of like developing a detection to tuning a detection to like understanding when to deprecate a detection. So how do you think about the threshold of false positives you're willing to maintain and like when a detection gets to the point where it should be end of life?
I feel like, so I mentioned this a little earlier. I feel like the person I feel like anytime an alert fire or detection fires, triggering an alert, like I feel like the person responding to it should be able to provide feedback about whether it's useful. I've been places before where someone will write a detection and then not document it at all and go on vacation. Why am I getting faced? I don't even know what this means. It's like not written out at all. The query is like impossible to understand. I think, and it's firing a lot. Specifically, that would happen with like impossible traveler alerts where you're saying, like, I can't even calculate, I can't figure out how you're calculating where they are. I'm not sure it's happening correctly. But I feel like there are a lot of like, there's sometimes you do want to be alerted for something, even if you know it's a false positive. Maybe, as we said, like maybe it's not paging people, but it's like lower and it gets kind of grouped together with other indicators and then kind of forms like a picture of what's happening. But I really feel like whoever is handling the alert should have the ability to give feedback, even if they don't write the detections themselves. Like they should be able to pipe feedback in to say, this is not helpful. It's not clear what you want us to do. I think there are a lot of really good talks about alert fatigue and things like that that I think are so critical. And I know there's a really good talk one of my old coworkers at Stripe, Aditya, made that was about like alert fatigue, and they're on like an observability team. So I think like a lot of the lessons that we can pull there are probably not specific to security as well. But I think from a security perspective, like you really don't want to drop anything that could be important. I think sometimes something will fire and you'll decide it's a false positive, and then it'll turn out later something similar happens, and then that one did matter, but the other one was not really anything. It's pretty hard. I think you have to be really flexible with your alerting. I think you have to, I just really feel like you have to keep iterating constantly and have a tight feedback loop of how did it go, and maybe quarterly review your alerting, your detections, whatever it is. But I think if you have too many false positives that look the exact same and they're thrashing your team, I feel like everyone's going to burn out. It's going to feel bad for everybody. And it's not satisfying. I think there are a lot of ways to make it satisfying and feel like people control what they're looking at.
Super point. Yeah, I mean, I agree. The relationship that detection has with incident response is super important. And I mentioned earlier, like we try to bake that into our process as much as possible. And so starting out front with like the detection building, evolving then in our detection reviews, we can't put our detections into prod until like someone from incident response has given us a sign off that they understand why we built this detection. And from there, once it's in production, the incident response team can send us like what we can call detection improvement request. And so whether it's tuning or suppressing or changing the detection, they provide that feedback to us, and we have our own like on call where we work on those requests. And this year we've baked into it like a part of the life cycle is an auto quarantine. And so if I'm gonna throw a number out there, like the alert has fired 20 times in 1 hour, it's gonna get auto quarantine. Is getting taken out of prod, and we have to fix it, right? If we want it back in prod. I think that helps with like the fatigue that the incident response team will get, and we get to improve our detections in that respect. And it is automatically from there, once we tune it, put into like a staging environment where if it's not firing anymore after a certain time period, it will automatically get promoted back into production. And so streamlining that so it's as automated as possible for both like incident response and detection, like super important. It's a lift on both sides.
Yeah, it's an interesting, I think like thinking about the detection lifecycle is definitely like something that needs to be like more widely shared in the community. because there's definitely some detections that like we'll make and then it'll be like, this should never fire. Like, I never want to see this. And sometimes you don't know that knowledge. And then you're like picking something up 5 years later and you're like, this hasn't fired in 5 years. Like, let's get rid of it. And then you realize it was like actually really important to have in place. Like, so I think having like kind of all that understanding of like, there's some detections that should never fire, and that's great. And then there's some detections that if they're not firing, like maybe the logging pipeline broke, maybe the vendor data schema changed, like maybe there's an issue that we have to fix. Like, so kind of having like this iterative automated like feedback of like, all right, this has never fired. And like knowing kind of which like half that falls down of like, I have to review the data, or like, that's fine, like continue on. But also like the nuance of like, oh, I'm being spammed by alerts. Like there's definitely this case where like someone runs something, like maybe they're updating like every single host, like with a new agent, you know? So you get like, 10,000 alerts because like your endpoint security team is updating hosts like that. Like, I think ideally with something like that, where it's just like a high volume in a very short period of time, like hopefully like your SOAR and like your case management can like identify that trend and be like, I'm just going to group this all for you, like all in one place. And like, you can just ignore it. Cause like, obviously like some things awry. But I think when like you have like a lot of alerts that are all noise, and it's, the feedback from your IR team of like, this is a false positive, this is a false positive, this is a false positive. Like that feedback is more like, let's take a look at this detection. Like, what's the goal? And like, why is it so noisy? And like, can we actually improve it? Like, so again, I think there's like a lot of variants of like how to rethink detections and making them meaningful. And like certain things are like, if they fire, like if they spam you, it makes sense, versus like if they never fire, it makes sense. And like having that like knowledge ingrained in the team, and like also communicating that widely and like sharing it with others. So like, again, like being able to automate the detection life cycle. So like a lot of this can just like happen automatically instead of you being like, oh, like I know that happens that way, and just like, tribal knowledge. And like, cause I think a lot of people experience that like throughout the industry, and it's just like normal trends that are just like not necessarily talked about all the time.
Yeah, you write one detection and then like someone leaves the company and then you're like, what does this detection mean? Why is it firing so much? Definitely. And then also, Tammy, to your point, I've also done the auto suppression approach, and it's been really nice and like helping like get those false positives down and not like creating alert fatigue for the IR team. So highly recommend like good case management that groups by entities and like auto suppresses, like amazing.
And we review with our incident response team metrics for what they're closing the cases at. And, so it's embarrassing if you're like, oh, like, this detection that I built had like, X amount of false positives. You want to get your metrics down as well. You want to get high fidelity alerts. And so having that feedback is always helpful.
Yeah, I want to end on like kind of something you guys are excited about. So what is a tool, approach, or strategy that you expect to become mainstream in detection and response going forward?
I feel like one thing that I've experienced and I think is really powerful and like increasingly powerful is like within the industry, like pure companies sharing information about, with legal consent, everything like that. Like all the, everyone is checking, making sure it's okay. But like, sharing information about common attack patterns, common like detections that people will write, like different strategies about logging, things like that. Like I feel like sharing information at a small scale where you can share it more quickly and you can kind of say like, hey, I wrote these scripts for like Tines, for example, like here, you could just deploy these if you want. Like you could see if it works for you, or if it doesn't, like, just let me know. I'll like, I don't know, we can work on it together. I feel like there are a lot of, I don't know, there's just so much, especially with like attackers that are targeting a specific industry, it can be super helpful to just collaborate. We see more of that for sure.
And say mine would be, okay, so there's a couple things. I'm going to vomit a little bit here. So risk-based alerting, I'm super excited about that. How can we better improve the foundations, our controls, the asset management, so that we can feed our risk-based alerting? Essentially, I want to make like everything quantitative based, right? Like Tammy, employee, has a risk of 20 because maybe I have like X permissions to the system. But in addition to that, adding in another passion project was like insider threat, right? User and entity behavioral analytics. working with our data science, we can look at these like specific indicators and raising my risk score because I am doing like some SaaS activity that doesn't exactly warrant an alert. And so that would tie into like the Yuba aspect with my risk score. And having like the risk-based learning in that perspective. I think there's so many other things that we can feed into like a Yuba model that would tie into risk-based alerting and really make it a lot more granular, making the detection very granular. So it's no longer just low, medium, and high. Like incident response like has 10 highs, like which one do they look at first? And so having that quantitative, score for each alert helps them prioritize what they really need to be working on based off detection and whatever entity is involved in that.
Yeah, that's a good one. I would say like I think baseline analysis is going to become like more popular and more regularly used in threat detection. Like, so having the skills to like take a large volume of data and kind of understand like what normal is and kind of like the outliers, and then to dig into the outliers and be like, is this bad, or is this just kind of an issue with how we let people develop here, or is it just like something we should put like a control in place where it's just like the way we onboard interns is just like not great, like everyone's sharing passwords, like using it to figure out like kind of the long tail and finding meaning in data, because like I think inevitably like threat detection teams are always buried in data, and like the end goal is like finding value, and I think baseline analysis is like really crucial for doing that regardless of like your tooling or your environment. And I think if it becomes more of a best practice, it's going to have a lot of impact everywhere.
Yeah, I agree. I think like both risk-based alerting, applying more of like a data engineering and data science approach to detection engineering not only makes us more quantitative and gives us more metrics, but also gets us into the data and the important stuff. So I'm really excited for that. But I just want to thank our panelists for talking with me about all this stuff. Again, like if you guys are interested in detection engineering, come talk to us. We would love to chat. And I just want to give a second thank you because this has been a couple months in the making. So super excited to actually do this panel with them.
Yeah, thanks for coming. Thanks for most of it.